Sarah's heart stopped when she heard the scream from the backyard. She dropped the phone mid-call and raced through the kitchen, nearly knocking over a chair in her desperation to reach the back door. The few seconds it took felt like an eternity as her mind conjured horrific possibilities. She had only stepped inside for a moment, just one moment, to take that important call. When she burst through the door onto the patio, the scene before her froze her blood. Apollo, their massive German shepherd, had his jaws clamped around Emma's clothing, dragging her small 5-year-old body forcefully across the yard. Emma's face was contorted in confusion and fear as the powerful dog yanked her away from her toys, his muscular body tense and focused with terrifying intensity. "Emma!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking with panic. In that instant everything slowed down. Every decision Sarah had made flashed before her: adopting Apollo despite everyone's warnings, leaving Emma alone with him despite her ex-husband's objections, stepping inside for just a minute, despite her own better judgment. Time compressed into that single horrifying tableau, her daughter helpless in the jaws of a rescued dog with an unknown past. Sarah lunged forward, her only thought to reach her daughter before it was too late, before the unthinkable happened. What had she done? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell hadn't planned on being a single mother at 36. The divorce from Michael had been finalized just 7 months ago, leaving her to raise Emma alone in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The move to Oak Ridge, a small rural community on the outskirts of Portland, was meant to be a fresh start, a place where the cost of living wouldn't strangle her teacher's salary, where Emma could have a yard to play in, and where the memories of their broken family wouldn't haunt every corner. But the transition had been harder than Sarah anticipated. Emma had grown withdrawn, often asking when Daddy would visit, not fully understanding that the 3-hour drive made weekend visits complicated and infrequent. Night terrors became routine, and the bright, chatty child Sarah had known seemed to fade a little more each day. It was Emma's therapist who had suggested a pet might help, a companion to ease the loneliness and provide the unconditional love Emma so desperately needed. The local shelter wasn't Sarah's first choice, but their modest budget didn't allow for a purebred puppy with papers and a pristine lineage. The moment she saw Apollo, though, something shifted. The German shepherd sat in the back of his kennel, dignified despite his circumstances, with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. He was rescued from an abusive situation, the shelter worker explained. Previous owner used harsh training methods. He was scheduled to be euthanized tomorrow. Nobody wants an adult shepherd with his history. When Apollo gently took a treat from Emma's small hand without any hesitation, Sarah made the decision that would change their lives. Despite the shelter worker's warnings about his past, despite Michael's furious phone call when he found out, "Are you trying to put our daughter in danger?" Despite the whispers from neighbors who eyed the large dog warily, Sarah brought Apollo home. The first days were tentative. Sarah watched like a hawk, never leaving Emma and Apollo alone together. But as days turned to weeks, she witnessed a transformation. Emma's nightmares subsided when Apollo took to sleeping at the foot of her bed. The little girl's laughter, a sound Sarah had feared might be lost forever, returned as she played fetch and hide and seek with her new companion. Apollo, for his part, seemed to understand his role in their fragile family, following Emma with watchful eyes, positioning himself between the child and any perceived threat, even if that threat was just the mail carrier or a squirrel that dared enter their yard. In Apollo, Sarah saw not the dangerous animal her ex-husband and neighbors feared, but a second chance at healing for them all. The morning had started like any other in the Mitchell household. Sarah woke at 6, grateful that Apollo had already let himself out through the dog door to do his business in the fenced backyard. She prepared Emma's lunch: peanut butter sandwich with the crust cut off, apple slices, and a chocolate chip cookie before gently waking her daughter. Emma's morning routine had become easier with Apollo's steady presence. The dog would nudge her when she dawdled too long over breakfast or when she got distracted while brushing her teeth. By 7:45, Emma was dressed in her favorite blue overalls and yellow t-shirt, her blonde hair neatly braided, ready for Sarah to drop her at kindergarten before heading to the elementary school where Sarah taught 4th grade. But then came the call. As Sarah was pouring her travel mug of coffee, her phone rang with the school principal's number. "Sarah, I hate to do this to you, but can you come in early? The superintendent is making a surprise visit, and I need your help with the presentation for the literacy program." Her mind raced through the option she couldn't be late dropping Emma at kindergarten. But the superintendent's visit could determine whether their school received critical funding. "I'll figure something out, Barbara. Give me 45 minutes. As she hung up, Sarah made a quick calculation. School wasn't for another hour. The neighbor who sometimes watched Emma was out of town. Michael lived 3 hours away. Her mother was visiting her sister in Florida. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level. "Sweetie, there's an emergency at Mommy's school. How would you feel about staying home with Apollo this morning? We can have a special movie day this afternoon to make up for it." Emma's face lit up at the prospect of missing school and having Apollo all to herself. Sarah hesitated, remembering Michael's warning, the neighbor's concerns, though. The community meeting that had been scheduled for next week specifically to discuss dangerous animals in residential areas, a thinly veiled reference to Apollo. But in the 3 months since they'd adopted him, Apollo had been nothing but gentle and protective. The yard was securely fenced. She would only be gone 2 hours, 3 at most. "We'll play in the backyard, Mommy. I'll show Apollo my new chalk drawings," Emma said, already pulling on her rain boots, although the April morning was clear and sunny. Sarah helped Emma gather her sidewalk chalk, bubbles, and a few toys, then led her and Apollo into the backyard. She double-checked the gate latch, made sure Emma's water bottle was full, and reminded her of the rules: stay in the yard, don't open the gate for anyone, don't climb the tree. "Apollo will watch over you until I get back," Sarah said, ruffling the dog's thick fur. Apollo seemed to understand, sitting attentively beside Emma, his eyes focused on Sarah as if receiving instructions. "I'll be back before you know it." The school meeting went longer than expected. The superintendent had questions about everything from curriculum to building maintenance. By the time Sarah could politely excuse herself, it was almost noon. She'd been gone nearly 4 hours. She called home twice, but with no answer, her anxiety mounted with each passing minute of the drive home. As she turned onto their street, Sarah noticed several of her neighbors standing in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman from across the street, actually crossed herself when she saw Sarah's car approaching. Something was wrong. Sarah barely put the car in park before jumping out, leaving the driver's door open as she raced toward the house. That's when she heard Emma's high-pitched scream from the backyard. The sound cut through her like a physical pain, driving her forward with adrenaline-fueled speed. And through the kitchen she flew, knocking over a chair in her desperation, yanking open the back door with such force that the handle left an indentation in the adjacent wall. The scene that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory: Apollo, his teeth firmly gripping Emma's overalls, dragging her backward across the lawn. Emma's face showed confusion and fear, her small hands trying to push away the powerful dog. Sarah's mind went blank with terror. This was exactly what everyone had warned her about: a rescue dog with an unknown past, a history of abuse, a breed known for strength and aggression. And she had left her 5-year-old daughter alone with him. "Apollo, no!" Sarah screamed, sprinting across the lawn. The dog didn't release Emma, instead pulling her more urgently, almost frantically. But Sarah reached them in seconds, grabbing Emma and trying to pry her from Apollo's grip. But the dog was strong, determined. When Sarah tried to push him away, Apollo gave a low growl, the first aggressive sound she'd ever heard from him, and continued pulling Emma by her clothing. "Let go of her," Sarah yelled, her voice breaking with panic and rage. She managed to get her arms around Emma, lifting her up, but Apollo jumped up too, still gripping the child's overalls. That's when Sarah noticed something odd. Apollo wasn't trying to bite Emma. He was very precisely holding only the fabric of her clothing, careful not to catch skin. And he wasn't pulling her randomly, he was moving her in a specific direction, away from where they had been playing near the old oak tree. Sarah's confusion lasted only a moment before she saw it. Coiled in the grass where Emma had been playing just seconds earlier was a large snake. its distinctive patterned scales visible even from several feet away. The snake was poised to strike, its attention now divided between the humans and the dog, disturbing its sunning spot. A cold realization washed over Sarah. Apollo wasn't attacking Emma. He was saving her. As if on cue, the moment Emma was safely out of striking range, Apollo released her overalls and positioned himself between the snake and the humans. His posture changed completely, hackles raised, teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. This was a different Apollo than Sarah had ever seen, transformed from family pet to fierce protector in an instant. The snake, confronted with this new threat, struck out with lightning speed. Sarah screamed as she saw the snake's fangs connect with Apollo's foreleg. The dog yelped in pain but held his ground, snapping at the snake until it retreated to the base of the oak tree and disappeared into a previously unnoticed hole among the roots. Only then did Apollo turn back to him, his protected mission accomplished. He took 2 steps toward Sarah and Emma, his gait already unsteady, before collapsing onto the lawn. His breathing became labored, foam appearing at the corners of his mouth. The realization hit Sarah with horrifying clarity. Apollo had taken a venomous snake bite meant for her daughter. And now he was dying because of it. Sarah knelt beside Apollo, her mind racing. The German shepherd's breathing had become shallow and irregular, his powerful body trembling uncontrollably. Emma stood frozen nearby, tears streaming down her face, her small voice repeating, "Is Apollo going to die, Mommy?" Sarah assessed the situation with mounting panic. Yep, the snake bite was already causing severe swelling around Apollo's foreleg, and his symptoms were progressing rapidly. She knew venomous snake bites could kill within hours if untreated, and for a dog Apollo's size, perhaps even faster. She needed to get him to a veterinarian immediately, but there was another problem, Emma. She couldn't leave her 5-year-old daughter alone, but every minute that passed put Apollo in greater danger. "Emma, sweetheart, we need to get Apollo to the animal doctor right away," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice calm despite her racing heart. "He's very sick from the snake bite." Emma nodded solemnly, her eyes never leaving the dog who had just saved her life. Sarah weighed her limited options. Michael was 3 hours away. Her regular babysitter was unavailable. Her neighbors, the thought stopped her cold. Most of her neighbors had made their feelings about Apollo quite clear. They considered him dangerous, a liability. All except one, perhaps. Dr. Reynolds lived just 2 houses down, a retired physician who had made no secret of his disapproval when Sarah adopted Apollo. He had even been the one organizing the community meeting about dangerous animals. But he was also a doctor, someone who had dedicated his life to saving others. Would he help? With shaken hands, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Reynolds' number. "Dr. Reynolds, this is Sarah Mitchell from down the street. I have an emergency." She struggled to keep her voice steady. "My dog Apollo has been bitten by a venomous snake protecting my daughter. I need to get him to the vet immediately, but I have no one to watch Emma. Could you possibly?" She let the question hang, already anticipating his refusal. The silence on the other end of the line seemed to stretch forever before Dr. Reynolds finally spoke. "Your dog was bitten protecting Emma?" His tone was measured, careful. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. He pulled her away from a snake by her clothing. He put himself between them. The snake struck him instead of her. Another long pause followed. "Bring Emma here," Dr. Reynolds finally said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "Go save your dog." With that problem solved, Sarah faced her next challenge, getting a 90-pound, increasingly unresponsive German shepherd into her car. "Emma, run and get Apollo's blanket from his bed," she instructed, trying to give her daughter a useful task while she figured out how to move the dog. Emma darted into the house, returning moments later with Apollo's well-worn blue blanket. Sarah spread it on the ground next to Apollo, then carefully rolled him onto it. With the blanket as a makeshift stretcher, she began dragging Apollo toward the driveway, his dead weight nearly impossible for her to move alone. She had only made it halfway across the yard when she heard a voice. "Need a hand?" Her neighbor Tom from across the street stood at the gate, taking in the scene. Without waiting for an answer, he hurried over and took the other end of the blanket. Together they maneuvered Apollo into the back of Sarah's SUV. "I heard what happened from Mrs. Peterson," Tom explained. "Bird travels fast. For what it's worth, I think we all had Apollo wrong." Sarah could only nod her thanks, too focused on the next steps to fully process his words. After dropping Emma with Dr. Reynolds, who welcomed her with unexpected warmth, Sarah sped toward the veterinary hospital, her mind replaying the morning's events on an endless loop. Each glance in the rearview mirror showed Apollo's condition worsening, his breathing more labored, his normally alert eyes now dull and unfocused. "Stay with me, Apollo," she pleaded, running a red light and narrowly avoiding a collision. "Emma needs you. I need you." The 15-minute drive to the animal hospital was the longest of Sarah's life. Memories of the day she'd first seen Apollo at the shelter flashed through her mind, how he'd sat with quiet dignity despite his circumstances. How he'd gently taken treats from Emma's small hands, how the shelter worker had mentioned he was scheduled for euthanasia the very next day. "No one wants an adult shepherd with his history," they'd said. She remembered Michael's anger when he found out, the neighbors' whispered concerns, her own moments of doubt during those first few weeks. Had she made a terrible mistake bringing Apollo home? Now, with her dog dying in the back of her car because he'd saved her daughter, the answer seemed crushingly clear. Sarah screeched into the veterinary hospital parking lot and ran inside, words tumbling out in a panicked rush to the startled receptionist. "My dog's snake bite, please hurry, he's dying." A team of veterinary technicians rushed out with a gurney, efficiently transferring Apollo from her vehicle and whisking him through double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." But the vet tech stayed behind to get information while the others began treatment. "What kind of snake? How long ago was the bite? Any medications or health conditions we should know about?" Sarah answered mechanically, her eyes fixed on the doors where Apollo had disappeared. In the waiting room, Sarah collapsed into a chair, the adrenaline that had carried her through the last half hour suddenly evaporating, leaving her shaking and exhausted. That's when she noticed she wasn't alone. The man sat across from her, watching with an intensity that might have been concerning under different circumstances. He was perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His eyes, however, were striking the same unusual amber color as Apollo's. "German Shepherd?" the man asked, simply nodding toward the treatment area. Sarah nodded, too drained to wonder how he knew. "Special dogs," he continued. "Loyal to a fault, protective, smart as whips." He seemed to be weighing his next words carefully. "Your dog he in there because he protected someone?" Something about the man's quiet certainty made Sarah look at him more closely. "Yes," she admitted. "He saved my daughter from a snake, pulled her away, and got bitten himself." The man nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Not surprising, that's what they're bred for, protection. It's in their blood." He paused, then added, "I've worked with shepherds all my life. Military, police, search and rescue. Best dogs in the world, if you ask me." Before Sarah could respond, a veterinarian in scrubs appeared through the double doors, her expression grave. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Patel. We've stabilized Apollo for now and administered anti-venom, but I won't sugarcoat this, his condition is critical. The next 24 hours will be touch and go. You got him here quickly, which helps, but snake venom is particularly dangerous for canines, attacking the nervous system and causing organ damage." She hesitated, then added gently, "You should prepare yourself and your family for the possibility that he might not pull through." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything, after Apollo had finally found a home, after he'd saved Emma, after he'd proven wrong everyone who had doubted him, he might still die. The injustice of it was overwhelming. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Briefly, Dr. Patel agreed. "He's sedated, but familiar voices and scents can sometimes help. Then I suggest you go home to your daughter. We'll call you with any developments and you can come back in the morning." As Sarah followed the veterinarian through the double doors, she was vaguely aware of the stranger watching her go, his amber eyes thoughtful and somehow knowing. By early afternoon, news of the incident had spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Sarah had barely returned to Dr. Reynolds' house to collect Emma when her phone began buzzing with notifications. Neighbors she'd never spoken to were texting to ask if Emma was all right. Parents from Emma's kindergarten class called offering meals and childcare. The local newspaper had already left 2 voicemails requesting an interview. When Sarah pulled into her driveway with Emma dozing in the back seat, exhausted from the morning's trauma, she was startled to find a small group of residents gathered on the sidewalk in front of her house. "Is it true?" called Mrs. Peterson, the elderly busybody who had been one of Apollo's most vocal critics. "That big dog of yours saved little Emma from a copperhead." Before Sarah could correct her, it hadn't been a copperhead, another neighbor chimed in. "I heard it was a rattlesnake." "My cousin said it was a water moccasin," added someone else. Sarah recognized the town's growing tendency to embellish as stories passed from person to person. Daddy, in a community of just over 5,000, entertainment often came in the form of local drama. "It was a snake," Sarah confirmed, keeping her voice low as she gently lifted the sleeping Emma from her car seat. "Apollo protected Emma from it, and was bitten in the process. He's at the veterinary hospital in critical condition." Her voice broke on the last words, the reality of potentially losing Apollo hitting her anew. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her earlier suspicion seemingly replaced with concern. "We've started a collection," she said, gesturing to her phone. "Online fundraiser for the vet bills. Denise's boy set it up. He's good with those computer things." Sarah was stunned. Just last week, Mrs. Peterson had been collecting signatures for a petition to have Apollo removed from the neighborhood. "I might have been wrong about your dog," the older woman admitted, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "Protective instinct is one thing, but what he did today, well, that's something else." Inside, Sarah settled Emma on the couch and checked her phone. The fundraiser Mrs. Peterson had mentioned already had over $2,000 in donations, with comments from townspeople expressing their hopes for Apollo's recovery. There were also messages from Michael, increasingly frantic as he'd apparently heard garbled versions of the day's events. The latest read, "Call me immediately. Heard Emma in hospital after dog attack." Sarah sighed and dialed his number, bracing herself for the conversation. Michael answered on the first ring. "What the hell happened, Sarah?" "I get a call from Bill saying there was some kind of incident with that dog and Emma's in the hospital." His voice was tight with barely controlled panic and accusation. "Emma is fine, Michael. She's not in the hospital, Apollo is," Sarah explained, keeping her voice even despite her exhaustion. "There was a venomous snake in our backyard. Apollo pulled Emma away from it and got bitten protecting her. If he hadn't been there." She couldn't finish the sentence, the alternative too horrifying to voice. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his tone had shifted. "Emma's really okay?" he asked, the fight gone from his voice. "She's shaken up, but physically fine. Not a scratch on her. Apollo was very careful when he grabbed her clothes to pull her away." Sarah glanced at her daughter, still sleeping peacefully despite the trauma of the morning. "I'm coming over," Michael announced. "I'll be there in 3 hours." Sarah knew better than to argue. Despite their differences since the divorce, Michael was a devoted father who would naturally want to see for himself that Emma was safe. "We'll be here," she assured him. After hanging up, Sarah checked her messages again and found one from Dr. Patel at the veterinary hospital. "No change in Apollo's condition. Still critical but stable. We'll update if anything changes." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to draw comfort from the fact that no change meant Apollo was still fighting. Emma stirred on the couch, her small face scrunching in distress even before she fully woke. "Mommy? Where's Apollo? Is he still sick?" Her eyes were wide with concern, still red-rimmed from earlier tears. Sarah sat beside her daughter, drawing her close. "Apollo is at the animal hospital. The doctors are doing everything they can to make him better." She chose her words carefully, wanting to be honest without frightening Emma further. "But he will get better, right? He has to." Emma's certainty broke Sarah's heart. In Emma's 5-year-old world, things could always be fixed if you wanted them badly enough. I hope so, sweetheart. Apollo is very strong and very brave. Sarah stroked Emma's hair. And guess what? Daddy's coming to visit today. Emma's face brightened momentarily before clouding again. Will Daddy be mad at Apollo? He always says Apollo is dangerous. The question gave Sarah pause. Despite Michael's initial reaction on the phone, she wasn't sure how he would behave once he arrived. Would he see this incident as vindication of his concerns, or would he recognize Apollo's heroism? I think when Daddy hears how Apollo saved you, he'll feel differently, she said, hoping it was true. Throughout the afternoon, the stream of visitors and messages continued. Emma's kindergarten teacher brought over a get-well card for Apollo that her entire class had signed. The local news station called requesting an interview. Even the mayor stopped by briefly, mentioning something about a civilian hero award that had Sarah wondering if he was already thinking about the positive publicity during an election year. By the time Michael's car pulled into the driveway at 7 that evening, Sarah was emotionally and physically drained. She opened the door before he could knock, gesturing for him to keep his voice down as Emma had finally fallen back asleep after a difficult afternoon of questions and worry. Michael looked haggard, the 3-hour drive after a full workday evident in the shadows under his eyes. She's really okay? He asked immediately, peering past Sarah toward the living room where Emma slept. See for yourself, Sarah said, stepping aside to let him in. Physically, she's fine. Emotionally, she's worried sick about Apollo. Michael knelt beside the couch, gently brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. The tenderness in the gesture reminded Sarah of what she had once loved about him. After assuring himself that Emma was indeed unharmed, he turned back to Sarah. Tell me exactly what happened. Sarah recounted the morning's events as precisely as she could. Her need to leave for the school meeting, Apollo's actions when the snake appeared, but rushed to the veterinary hospital, and the community's surprising response. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. You left her alone, he finally said, his voice low but sharp. I left her with Apollo, Sarah corrected, though the guilt that had been gnawing at her all day intensified. And thank God I did, or she might have. She couldn't finish the sentence. This is exactly why I should have primary custody, Michael said, his lawyer's instincts evidently overriding any momentary goodwill. First you bring a dangerous dog into the house, then you leave our daughter unsupervised. That dangerous dog saved her life today. Sarah shot back, keeping her voice low for Emma's sake. Michael's response was cut off by a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find a man she didn't recognize until she realized it was the stranger from the veterinary hospital waiting room, the one with the amber eyes so like Apollo's. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice as quietly intense as his gaze. I apologize for coming to your home like this. I'm James Reeves. He hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. I believe you have my brother's dog. Sarah stared at him, uncomprehending. Behind her, she felt Michael move protectively closer. My brother Daniel Reeves, James continued. He was Apollo's original owner. The one who he trailed off, apparently unable to say the words. The one who abused him, Sarah finished, her voice hardening. The one who broke his ribs and starved him. James nodded, his expression pained. Yes, my brother has problems, severe ones. I've been searching for Apollo since I learned what Daniel had done to him. When I heard about a German shepherd saving a child from a snake bite at the clinic today, I had a feeling it might be him. He paused. Apollo was originally from a specialized breeding program for service and protection dogs. My brother acquired him under false pretenses, claiming he needed a service animal. Sarah felt her heart sink. Was this man here to reclaim Apollo? Be to take him away from them just when he'd proven his worth and found his place in their family? Apollo is my dog now, she said firmly. I adopted him legally from the shelter. James held up his hands placatingly. I'm not here to take him from you. Quite the opposite. I'm here to help. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. This contains Apollo's original training records, his medical history, and documentation of his lineage. He comes from an exceptional line of working German shepherds. His father was a decorated police K9. His mother a certified therapy dog. Apollo himself was in training for protection work when my brother acquired him. "Why are you giving me this?" Sarah asked, confused by the unexpected turn of events. "Because I heard at the clinic that Apollo might not make it," James said solemnly. "He calm. And because I know what he did today wasn't a fluke or an accident. It's who he is, who he was bred and trained to be. Brave protector." He looked past Sarah to where Michael stood, clearly having assessed the tension in the household. "And I thought this information might be important for your family to have right now. Especially if there are any questions about Apollo's temperament or suitability as a family dog." Michael stepped forward. "I'm Emma's father," he said, accepting the envelope from James. "And I do have questions about that dog's place in my daughter's life." Sarah watched, heart pounding, as Michael began to review the documents. His expression shifted from skepticism to surprise as he leafed through what appeared to be official certificates and training assessments. "This dog Apollo was a washout from a police K9 program?" he asked James. "Not a washout," James corrected. "He was actually excelling. But my brother managed to acquire him before his training was complete by falsifying documents claiming he needed a service animal for PTSD. By the time I found out and reported him, when the damage was done, Apollo had been abused to the point that the training center didn't want to take him back. They were concerned about behavioral issues after the trauma. Yet he protected my daughter today," Michael said slowly, as if trying to reconcile this new information with his preconceptions. "Because that's what he was bred and trained to do," James confirmed. "German shepherds, especially from his lineage, have an instinctive drive to protect their family members, particularly children." He turned to Sarah. "I'd like to help with Apollo's veterinary expenses. It's the least I can do, considering what my brother put him through." Sarah was about to respond when her phone rang. Dr. Patel's number flashed on the screen, and she answered immediately, her heart in her throat. "Hello? Court?" "Mrs. Mitchell, we've seen some changes in Apollo's condition," the veterinarian said, her voice carefully neutral in the way of medical professionals delivering uncertain news. "The anti-venom is working, but he's developed a reaction to the treatment itself. We need to adjust our approach. I wanted to let you know that the next 24 hours will be critical." Sarah clutched the phone tightly. "What are his chances?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief hesitation on the other end. "It's too soon to say with certainty. But Apollo is young and was in excellent health before this incident. That works in his favor." Dr. Patel paused again. "There is one more thing. We've had calls from several news organizations asking about Apollo's condition. Apparently your dog is becoming something of a local hero." After thanking the veterinarian and promising to visit first thing in the morning, Sarah hung up and relayed the update to Michael and James. The three of them stood in an uneasy triangle in her living room, united only by their concern for Apollo and Emma, each bringing their own complications to an already fraught situation. Before anyone could speak further, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert from the local station. The headline made her blood run cold. "Child endangered by rescue dog. Community questions pet adoption policies." Sarah opened the article to find quotes from a town council member suggesting that the incident, significantly distorted from the actual events, demonstrated the need for stricter regulations on dangerous breeds within city limits. The final paragraph mentioned an emergency town hall meeting scheduled for the following evening to discuss the matter. The community's response, it seemed, wasn't as unanimously supportive as Sarah had initially believed. "This is going to get complicated," Michael said, reading over her shoulder. His tone had shifted from accusatory to oddly protective. "You're going to need help navigating this." As if on cue, Emma stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily at the three adults. "Daddy, is Apollo coming home now?" The question hung in the air, simple yet laden with implications none of them could fully answer. The Oak Ridge Community Center had never been so crowded. By 6:30, 30 minutes before the emergency town hall meeting was scheduled to begin, every folding chair was occupied with latecomers lining the walls. Sarah sat in the front row, flanked by Michael on one side and James Reeves on the other, an unlikely alliance formed over the past 24 hours. Emma had reluctantly stayed behind with Dr. Reynolds, who had surprised everyone by offering to watch her during the meeting. "I have a stake in this too," the retired physician had said cryptically when Sarah thanked him. Mayor Wilson stood at the podium, visibly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. To his right sat Councilwoman Harris, who had been quoted in the misleading news article, and Animal Control Officer Jenkins. To his left were two empty chairs, presumably for speakers yet to arrive. "I want to thank everyone for coming on such short notice," Mayor Wilson began, his politician's smile not quite reaching his eyes. "As you all know, our community experienced a concerning incident yesterday involving a child and a dog. This meeting has been called to discuss potential policy changes regarding dangerous animals within city limits." Sarah bristled at the deliberate framing dangerous animals rather than hero dog, but Michael placed a calming hand on her arm. They had discussed their strategy beforehand, let others speak first, gauge the room, then present their case with the evidence James had provided. Councilwoman Harris took the podium next, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson. Yesterday's events have highlighted a serious gap in our community safety ordinances. A 5-year-old child was endangered by a rescue dog with an unknown history and aggressive breed tendencies. While we're thankful the child wasn't physically harmed, we must consider what could have happened." Sarah clenched her fists, struggling to maintain her composure as Councilwoman Harris continued to distort the facts. The woman never once mentioned the snake, instead focusing on Apollo's aggressive actions in dragging a child across a yard and his breed's well-documented history of attacks. She concluded by proposing an immediate moratorium on adopting out dangerous breeds from the local shelter and to requiring special permits for existing owners, permits that would be prohibitively expensive and difficult to obtain. Officer Jenkins spoke next, providing statistics on dog bites and attacks that Sarah suspected were national rather than local, given Oak Ridge's small size. He showed slides of various dangerous breeds, including German Shepherds, with Apollo's adoption photo featured prominently. This particular animal had a history of aggression before being placed with a family, including a young child. He claimed, a statement Sarah knew to be blatantly false. Just as Michael was about to rise and challenge Jenkins' assertions, the community center's door swung open. Dr. Reynolds entered, leading Emma by the hand. The sight of the small girl silenced the room momentarily. She wore a yellow dress, her favorite color, with a handmade pin pinned to it that read "Apollo's friend" in wobbling letters. Unlike the adults, Emma seemed unintimidated by the crowd, her eyes scanning the room until they locked on Sarah. "I thought Emma might have something to contribute," Dr. Reynolds explained, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "If the council has no objections." Mayor Wilson looked flustered but nodded. "Of course, we always welcome input from our youngest citizens." Emma walked to the front of the room with the straight-backed confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned to fear public speaking. Dr. Reynolds adjusted the microphone to her height and nodded encouragingly. "My name is Emma Mitchell and I'm 5 years old," she began clearly. "Apollo is my dog and my best friend. Yesterday a snake tried to bite me, but Apollo saved me. He pulled me away by my overalls and stood between me and the snake. Then the snake bit him instead of me." Her voice wavered slightly. "Apollo is in the hospital now because he saved me. He's a hero, not a bad dog." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at her daughter's simple eloquence. The room had gone completely still, the earlier hostility giving way to a different kind of tension. Emma wasn't finished, however. "Dr. Reynolds says Apollo might die," she continued, her small face serious. "But you want to make it so we can't keep him even if he gets better. That's not fair." Apollo didn't do anything wrong. He's a good dog." With that, Emma returned to Dr. Reynolds' side, taking his hand again as if for comfort. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat, clearly unsure how to proceed after Emma's unexpected testimony. "Thank you, young lady. We appreciate your perspective." He glanced at Councilwoman Harris, who looked markedly less confident than she had minutes before. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward then. "If I may, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to speak as well." "Dr. Reynolds, we didn't expect you to." "I know," the older man interrupted, "but I think it's important that I share my observations." Without waiting for permission, he moved to the podium. "Many of you know me. I've practiced medicine in this town for over 40 years before retiring. I've also been one of the most vocal critics of allowing so-called dangerous breeds in residential areas. In fact, I was the one who organized this very meeting." Sarah exchanged a confused glance with Michael. Where was Dr. Reynolds going with this? "But I was wrong," Dr. Reynolds continued, his voice strong despite his age. "Yesterday I witnessed something that changed my perspective entirely. When Sarah Mitchell called me in desperation, needing someone to watch her daughter while she rushed her dog to the veterinary hospital, I agreed reluctantly. I didn't understand why she would prioritize a dog over ensuring her child was properly supervised after such a traumatic event." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "But then Emma told me what happened. She showed me the spot in the yard where the snake had been. She demonstrated how Apollo had grabbed her overalls very carefully so he didn't hurt me, as she put it, and pulled her to safety. She described how Apollo had placed himself between her and the snake, effectively sacrificing himself." Dr. Reynolds turned back to the audience. "As a physician, I've spent my life evaluating evidence and making judgments based on facts, not fear. The facts in this case are clear. Apollo is not a danger to this community. On the contrary, he's an asset, a protector who saved a child's life at the risk of his own." The room erupted in murmurs as Dr. Reynolds stepped away from the podium. Mayor Wilson tried to restore order, but the mood had shifted perceptibly. Sarah seized the opportunity to stand, Michael and James flanking her supportively. "Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'd like to address the meeting as well," Sarah said, her teacher's voice cutting through the noise. She approached the podium with the confidence of someone who commanded classrooms daily, though her heart pounded in her chest. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am Emma's mother and Apollo's owner." She took a deep breath. "Yesterday morning, I made a decision that I've questioned every moment since I left my daughter playing in our backyard with our dog while I attended an emergency meeting at the school where I teach. When I returned, I witnessed a scene that initially terrified me. Apollo had his teeth on my daughter's clothing, dragging her across the yard." Sarah paused, making eye contact with various community members. "My first thought was exactly what many of you might think, that this was an attack. But then I saw the snake poised to strike where Emma had been playing seconds earlier. I realized that Apollo hadn't been attacking my daughter, he had been saving her life." She gestured to James, who stepped forward with his envelope of documents. "This is James Reeves. He has information about Apollo's background that directly contradicts some of the claims made earlier in this meeting." James distributed copies of Apollo's training records and photographs to the council members. "Apollo comes from a distinguished lineage of working German shepherds. Before he was rescued from an abusive situation, he was being trained for protection work. His actions yesterday weren't random or aggressive, they were exactly what he was bred and trained to do: protect the vulnerable, especially children." As the council members reviewed the documents, Sarah's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a message from Dr. Patel: "Apollo showing improvement. Still critical but responding to treatment. But call when you can." Relief flooded through her, but she forced herself to focus on the matter at hand. Michael stepped forward next, his presence commanding in the way only inexperienced attorneys could be. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Michael Mitchell, Emma's father. Until yesterday, I was one of Apollo's strongest critics. I worried about my daughter's safety living with a large dog of unknown background. He paused, letting the admission sink in. I was wrong. The documentation you're reviewing shows not only Apollo's exceptional lineage but also his specialized training. His actions yesterday were not those of a dangerous animal but of a highly trained protection dog performing exactly as he was meant to. Michael turned to face the audience directly. I'm a family law attorney. I understand the instinct to protect children through legislation. But any ordinance that would prevent dogs like Apollo from being part of our community would not enhance safety, it would reduce it. My daughter is alive today because of Apollo's protective instincts. Councilwoman Harris, visibly flustered by the turn of events, attempted to regain control of the narrative. While this is all very touching, the fact remains that large, powerful breeds pose an inherent risk, especially in households with children. The dog in question has a history of being abused, which can lead to unpredictable behavior. We must consider the safety of all children in our community, not just Emma. Before anyone could respond, the community center doors opened again. All heads turned to see Dr. Patel entering, still wearing her scrubs, looking exhausted but determined. I apologize for interrupting, she said, her voice carrying despite her evident fatigue. I'm Dr. Patel from Oak Ridge Veterinary Hospital. I've been treating Apollo since yesterday and I felt I needed to come here directly after my shift to address some misconceptions. Mayor Wilson, looking increasingly like he regretted calling the meeting, gestured for her to continue. I've reviewed the statement released by Animal Control, Dr. Patel said, nodding toward Officer Jenkins. It contains several factual errors about Apollo's condition and the incident itself. Apollo did not attack Emma Mitchell. The pattern of the bite wounds on Apollo's leg is consistent with a defensive position. He was standing between the snake and something he was protecting. This is confirmed by the fact that he has a single defensive bite, not multiple offensive strikes, which would indicate aggression. Dr. Patel approached the council table, handing over her own report. Furthermore, during Apollo's treatment, I've observed nothing to indicate previous aggressive tendencies. Even in extreme pain and under the stress of intensive medical intervention, he has remained gentle with hospital staff. This is particularly telling, as animals often revert to base instincts when in distress. As the council reviewed Dr. Patel's report, Sarah's phone vibrated again. This time it was a call, not a text. She stepped away from the podium to answer it, her heart racing with both hope and fear. Mrs. Mitchell? This is Nurse Garcia from Oak Ridge Veterinary Hospital, came a voice she didn't recognize. I'm calling about Apollo. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Yes, has something happened? He's experiencing complications from the anti-venom treatment. Dr. Patel wanted me to inform you immediately. His condition has deteriorated in the last hour. We're doing everything we can, but the nurse's professional demeanor softened. You might want to come as soon as possible. Bring your daughter if you feel it's appropriate, if there are goodbyes to be said. The nurse didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah thanked her mechanically and ended the call, her mind reeling. How could this be happening? Just minutes ago, Dr. Patel had reported improvement. Now Apollo was dying and she was trapped in this meeting fighting for a future that might not even matter anymore. Sarah returned to the front of the room, the grief evident on her face. Michael immediately moved to her side, concern replacing his professional demeanor. What is it? He asked quietly. It's Apollo, Sarah managed, her voice breaking. He's taken a turn for the worse. They're saying we should come now, to say goodbye. The words, though spoken softly, carried in the hushed room. Emma, who had been sitting quietly with Dr. Reynolds, jumped to her feet. Mommy, is Apollo going to heaven? Her small voice, filled with understanding beyond her years, broke the final barrier of Sarah's composure. I don't know, sweetheart, Sarah answered honestly, tears streaming down her face. But we need to go see him right now. Dr. Patel, overhearing the exchange, looked stricken. I left an hour ago. He was stabilizing then. I'll drive you there immediately. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat, clearly struggling with the emotional turn of events. I think this meeting can be adjourned for now. We'll reconvene at a later date after. He trailed off, unsure how to delicately reference the possible death of the dog around whom the entire controversy centered. As Sarah gathered Emma's things, preparing to leave for what might be their final moments with Apollo, Councilwoman Harris approached them. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by genuine concern. Mrs. Mitchell, she seemed at a loss for words. I'm sorry about your dog. Whatever the outcome of tonight's meeting would have been, that doesn't change the fact that Apollo did a brave thing for your daughter. Sarah managed a nod of acknowledgement, too focused on getting to the hospital to engage further. As their unlikely group, Sarah, Emma, Michael, James, Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Patel headed for the exit, Sarah became aware of movement behind him. The entire room had risen to its feet. One by one, the community members who had come to potentially vote Apollo out of their neighborhood formed a silent corridor of support, many with tears in their eyes. Outside, Michael took charge, his lawyer's mind cutting through the emotion to focus on logistics. Dr. Patel, you take Sarah and Emma in your car. You know the fastest route to the hospital. Dr. Reynolds, can you follow with James and me? At the older doctor's nod, Michael turned to Sarah, pulling her into a brief, fierce hug. We'll be right behind you. Apollo's not going to be alone, no matter what happens. As Sarah buckled Emma into Dr. Patel's car, her daughter clutched the small Apollo's friend pinned to her chest like a talisman. Mommy, she said with the simple faith of childhood, Apollo saved me from the snake. Now we have to save him. Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head, wishing she could promise that they would. Instead, she said, the only thing she knew for certain, we're going to try, sweetheart. With everything we have. The veterinary hospital's harsh fluorescent lighting cast everyone in a sickly pallor as Sarah and Emma rushed through the sliding doors, Dr. Patel leading the way. Michael, James and Dr. Reynolds followed moments later, creating an unlikely procession through the sterile corridors. The night nurse, surprised by the crowd arriving at 9:18 p.m., quickly ushered them to a private consultation room, rather than the standard waiting area. Apollo's been moved to our intensive care unit, the nurse explained, her voice professionally composed despite the gravity of the situation. Dr. Hoffman is with him now. He's our emergency specialist. She hesitated, glancing at Emma, clearly unsure how much to say in front of the child. Dr. Patel stepped in, kneeling to Emma's level. Emma, would you like to draw a picture for Apollo while the grown-ups talk for a minute? She produced a small notepad and pen from her pocket, a pediatric veterinarian's habitual tools for distracting children during difficult conversations. While Emma settled at a corner table with her impromptu art supplies, the adults huddled on the opposite side of the room. The nurse's expression conveyed the severity of the situation before she even spoke. Apollo's kidneys are failing, likely a reaction to both the venom and the anti-venom. His blood pressure is dangerously low, and he's developed cardiac arrhythmia, irregular heartbeat. Dr. Hoffman has him on IV fluids, medication for the arrhythmia and oxygen support, but... She paused, her professional demeanor slipping momentarily. We're doing everything medically possible, but you should prepare yourselves. Sarah felt Michael's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as the room seemed to tilt. Can we see him? She asked, her voice barely audible. Yes, but the nurse looked at Emma again. It might be distressing. He's connected to several machines, and he doesn't look like himself right now. Emma needs to see him, Sarah said with unexpected firmness. If Apollo doesn't make it, she needs to say goodbye. I won't deny her that closure. She recalled Emma's nightmare-filled months after Michael moved out, how the abrupt disappearance of her father from daily life had left psychological wounds that were still healing. She wouldn't let Apollo vanish from Emma's life without a chance for farewell. The ICU was quieter than Sarah expected, the beeping of monitors muted to reduce stress on the animals. Apollo occupied the largest enclosure, a glass-fronted room designed for larger breeds. The sight of him drove the breath from Sarah's lungs. The powerful, dignified dog who had saved her daughter lay motionless on a padded table, an oxygen mask over his muzzle, multiple IV lines running into his front leg, and monitoring equipment attached to his chest and paws. His normally alert ears lay flat against his head, and his eyes, when they fluttered open at their approach, were dull with pain and confusion. Emma froze in the doorway, her small hand tightening in Sarah's. "That's not Apollo," she whispered, horrified by the transformation of her vibrant playmate. "It is, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside her. "He's very sick, but it's still Apollo. He can hear you and smell you, even if he can't get up right now." Dr. Hoffman, a gray-haired man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, approached him. "You must be the Mitchell family. Apollo's been fighting hard." He addressed Emma directly, without the condescension adults often used with children. "Your dog is very brave. Would you like to talk to him? Sometimes that helps our patients feel better." Emma nodded solemnly, allowing Sarah to guide her to Apollo's side. The German shepherd's tail thumped weakly against the table at their approach, a heartbreaking shadow of his usual enthusiastic greeting. Emma hesitantly reached out to touch his paw, the only part of him that seemed free of medical equipment. "Hi, Apollo," she said, her voice small but clear. "Thank you for saving me from the snake. You have to get better now, okay? I drew you a picture." She held up her drawing, a child's representation of a girl and a dog standing together under a bright yellow sun. "See? It's us when you come home." Apollo's eyes, clouded with pain, fixed on Emma. With visible effort, he lifted his head slightly toward her, his tail giving another weak thump. The monitoring equipment registered a momentary spike in his heart rate, recognition perhaps, or a final rally of his fading strength. "I think he sees your picture, Emma," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That was very kind of you to make it for him." Dr. Hoffman cleared his throat discreetly. "I need to administer Apollo's next round of medication. Perhaps Emma would like to see our therapy cat in the next room. Marmalade is very friendly, and he helps comfort our patients' families." Understanding the doctor's intention to speak with the adults privately, Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. "I'd be happy to introduce Emma to Marmalade if that's all right, Sarah." With Emma safely out of earshot with Dr. Reynolds, Dr. Hoffman's professional optimism faded. "I won't mislead you. Apollo's condition is grave. The venom has caused cascading system failures that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Even with aggressive treatment, his chances of survival are—" He hesitated, clearly searching for words that wouldn't devastate them completely. "They're not good. If he makes it through the night, there's hope, but the next few hours are critical." James, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "Doctor, I've worked with military canines for many years. I've seen dogs recover from situations that should have been fatal. German shepherds, especially those from Apollo's lineage, have exceptional constitutions." Dr. Hoffman acknowledged this with a nod. "That's true, and it's certainly in his favor. His youth and prior excellent health also help. But I need you to understand the severity of the situation so you can make informed decisions." "What decisions?" Sarah asked, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "If his condition deteriorates further," Dr. Hoffman explained gently, "we may need to consider humane euthanasia to prevent suffering. Or we could attempt more aggressive interventions, but those carry their own risks and would significantly increase the already substantial cost of his care." Michael, who had been standing slightly apart, stepped forward. "Cost is not an issue. Whatever Apollo needs, he'll get." He met Sarah's surprised gaze. "He saved our daughter. Money is irrelevant." The unexpected solidarity from her ex-husband brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. Dr. Hoffman, sensing the emotional moment, tactfully excused himself to prepare Apollo's medications, leaving the three adults alone with the ailing dog. James moved closer to Apollo, examining him with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime with working dogs. "He's a fighter," he observed quietly, Look at his posture even now, he's trying to stay alert, to keep watch. It's in his blood. The three of them maintained a vigil beside Apollo, speaking softly to him, each in their own way acknowledging the debt they owed this animal who had selflessly protected a child. When Emma and Dr. Reynolds returned, Emma insisted on staying by Apollo's side, pulling a chair close to his enclosure and speaking to him about her day, her school, and all the things they would do together when he came home. The hours crawled by. Dr. Hoffman returned periodically to check Apollo's vitals and adjust his treatment. Each time his expression grew more grave, though he maintained a gentle optimism for Emma's benefit. Around midnight, Apollo suffered a seizure that left him even weaker, his breathing more labored. Dr. Hoffman took Sarah and Michael aside. I strongly recommend you take Emma home for the night. Apollo's condition is deteriorating. The next few hours will be— He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. I can't leave him, Sarah said, watching as Emma, exhausted, had finally fallen asleep with her head resting against Apollo's enclosure, in her small hand still reaching through the opening to touch his fur. I'll stay, James offered. I've been through this before with service dogs. I'll call you immediately if anything changes, better or worse. After much gentle coaxing and promises that Apollo wouldn't be alone, Sarah finally managed to persuade Emma to leave. Dr. James will stay with Apollo, she explained, using the title naturally, sensing it might reassure her daughter. He's an expert with special dogs like Apollo. Michael drove him home, the car ride passing in exhausted silence. Emma fell asleep again almost immediately, clutching her drawing of Apollo, now smudged and creased from being shown repeatedly to the dog. Once at Sarah's house, Michael carried Emma to her bed, removing only her shoes before tucking her in. You should try to sleep too, he told Sarah as they stood in the hallway outside Emma's room. I'll take the couch and stay over, in case he didn't need to finish, in case the call came during the night. Sarah nodded, too drained to argue or even express gratitude. She moved mechanically through her bedtime routine, her mind still at the veterinary hospital with Apollo. When she finally lay down, sleep eluded her. Her phone sat on the nightstand, charged and with the ringer at maximum volume, a silent promise and threat. Every time it buzzed with text messages of support from neighbors who had heard about Apollo's condition, her heart stopped, thinking it was the call she dreaded. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah gave up on sleep. She crept downstairs, surprised to find Michael also awake, sitting in the dark living room with a cup of tea. Couldn't sleep either, he asked softly. Sarah shook her head, joining him on the couch. The silence between them was companionable rather than strained, united in their concern for the dog who had saved their daughter and perhaps their fractured family as well. When James showed Apollo's training records at the town hall, Michael said after a while, one thing stood out to me. The assessment noted exceptional bond capacity. Apparently it's rare even among working dogs. It means Apollo forms unusually strong attachments, particularly with children. He paused. The trainer had written, "This dog will die to protect his person." I thought it was hyperbole. It wasn't, Sarah whispered, the reality of Apollo's sacrifice fully hitting her. He knew exactly what he was doing when he put himself between Emma and that snake. The call came at 4:17 a.m. Sarah's hand shook so badly that Michael had to take the phone from her to answer it. She watched his face as he listened, trying to read his expression in the dim light. When he hung up, his eyes met hers. "James says we need to come now," he said softly. "Dr. Hoffman doesn't think Apollo will make it to sunrise." The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Sarah and Michael as they hurried back to the veterinary hospital, leaving Emma in Dr. Reynolds' care. Neither spoke during the drive, each lost in their own thoughts about the dog who had become so integral to their lives in such a short time. The hospital's entrance blazed with light against the darkness, a beacon guiding them to what they feared would be their final moments with Apollo. Dr. Hoffman met them in the reception area, his expression grave but not yet defeated. "He's hanging on," he explained, leading them toward the ICU. "James hasn't left his side all night." I've never seen anything quite like it. Apollo's vitals improve when James speaks to him. It's as if he's responding to the familiarity of someone who understands his training. When they entered Apollo's room, they found James sitting beside the enclosure, one hand extended through the opening to rest on Apollo's shoulder. The German shepherd's breathing was labored, each rise and fall of his chest a visible struggle, but his eyes were open, alert despite his weakened state. He's been like this for the past hour, James said without turning, fighting, refusing to let go. There was something in his voice, respect, perhaps a recognition of a shared trait. I've been telling him stories about his brothers and sisters from the training program, the amazing things they've done. I think he understands he comes from a line of heroes. Sarah approached Apollo's other side, gently stroking his head. "We're here, Apollo," she whispered. "Emma's safe at home because of you." At the mention of Emma's name, Apollo's tail gave a feeble thump against the table. Dr. Hoffman, checking the monitoring equipment, raised his eyebrows. "His heart rate stabilizes when you talk to him. Keep doing that." For the next hour they maintained a vigil around Apollo, talking softly, reminiscing about his time with the family, the way he had transformed their lives. Occasionally Dr. Hoffman would adjust medications or check vital signs, his expression revealing nothing of Apollo's chances. As sunrise approached, casting the first pale light through the hospital windows, the door to the ICU swung open. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Reynolds stood there, Emma's small hand clutched in his. The child's face was resolute despite her obvious fatigue, her Apollo's friend pin secured to her pajama top. "I apologize for the intrusion," Dr. Reynolds said, sounding not at all apologetic. "Emma woke up and insisted on coming. I made a medical judgment that it might benefit both patient and child." Before either parent could protest, Emma rushed to Apollo's side. "I know you're trying to go to heaven," she said matter-of-factly to the dog, "but you can't go yet. We haven't finished our adventures." Apollo's eyes, which had been drifting, closed, focused suddenly on Emma. With visible effort, he lifted his head slightly toward her. Dr. Hoffman, observing the monitors, made a small sound of surprise. "His oxygen levels are improving," he noted, checking the equipment to ensure it was functioning correctly. "And his heart rhythm is stabilizing." Dr. Reynolds approached, his manner shifting from that of a concerned neighbor to the confident physician he had been for decades. "May I?" he asked Dr. Hoffman, gesturing toward Apollo's medical chart. After receiving a nod, he studied the records carefully, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "You've been treating this as a standard reaction to snake venom and antivenom," he observed. "But look at these patterns, the delayed reaction, the specific organ systems affected. This resembles cases I've seen in human medicine where there's an underlying factor complicating the presentation." Dr. Hoffman frowned, defensive but professional. "With respect, Dr. Reynolds, veterinary medicine differs significantly from—" "Of course it does," Dr. Reynolds interrupted, "but certain principles remain constant across species." He pointed to specific entries in the chart. "Have you tested for pre-existing conditions that might exacerbate a reaction to the treatments, particularly autoimmune markers?" The younger doctor paused, considering. "No, given the acute nature of the crisis and clear cause." "Test him," Dr. Reynolds insisted, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in medical settings. "I've seen this before. Not in dogs, but the principle may apply." While the doctors conferred, Sarah noticed that James had gone very still, his expression distant, as if recalling something important. "Apollo's father," he said suddenly. "He had an unusual reaction to a standard vaccine. The breeding program kept it quiet because it was a one-time incident, but," he looked at Dr. Reynolds with newfound respect, "you might be onto something." Dr. Hoffman, after a moment's consideration, nodded. "I'll order the tests. It's unorthodox," but at this point he gestured toward Apollo, whose condition, while still grave, had somehow stabilized in Emma's presence. "We have nothing to lose." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical activity. Emma refused to leave Apollo's side, so the adults took turns staying with her while the others caught short naps in the waiting room. By mid-morning, Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Hoffman emerged from their consultation with renewed energy. We were treating the symptoms, not the underlying condition, Dr. Hoffman explained, his earlier defensiveness replaced with professional excitement at a potential breakthrough. Apollo has an uncommon immune response that essentially causes his body to overreact to certain proteins both in the venom and in our standard treatments. We've adjusted his medication accordingly. Will he be okay now? Emma asked, direct as only children can be. The veterinarian knelt to her level. We can't promise anything, Emma. Apollo is still very sick. But we've given him a better fighting chance. Around noon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Dr. Reynolds drew Sarah and Michael aside. His normally stern features had softened, and for the first time Sarah noticed the deep sadness that seemed to reside permanently in his eyes. There's something I need to tell you, he said quietly. Something I should have shared a long time ago. He guided them to a private consultation room, closing the door behind him. 27 years ago, my son Daniel was attacked by a German shepherd, he began, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the topic. He was 5 years old, much like Emma. The dog belonged to our neighbor. It had always seemed gentle, playable. One day it turned on Daniel without warning, or so I believed at the time. The injuries were significant. Daniel survived, but he required extensive reconstructive surgery. Sarah gasped softly, understanding dawning. That's why you opposed Apollo being in the neighborhood. Dr. Reynolds nodded. I've spent nearly 3 decades warning people about the dangers of certain breeds, especially around children. It became something of a crusade for me. He paused, gathering himself. But yesterday, watching Apollo protect Emma, and then last night when I saw how devastated she was by the thought of losing him, I began to question everything I believed. What changed your mind? Michael asked. I called the family who had owned the dog that attacked Daniel. We haven't spoken since we moved away shortly after the incident. The wife answered her husband passed years ago. When I explained why I was calling, she said something that shook me to my core. Dr. Reynolds took a deep breath. She said, we always wondered if you knew about the snake. Sarah and Michael exchanged confused glances. Apparently after we left, they found a dead snake in their yard, venomous, like the one in your garden. They believed the dog wasn't attacking Daniel, it was protecting him, just as Apollo protected Emma. But in the chaos and terror of the moment, all I saw was my son being mauled. I never gave that dog a chance to be understood. His voice broke slightly. I've spent nearly 3 decades blaming an animal that may have been trying to save my son's life. The revelation hung in the air between them, its implications unfolding like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Not only had Dr. Reynolds been wrong about Apollo, but his entire crusade against dangerous breeds had been built on a misunderstanding, a tragedy compounded by misinterpretation. That's why I brought Emma to the hospital this morning, he continued. I couldn't bear the thought of another child losing a protector because of fear and ignorance, even my own. Before Sarah or Michael could respond, James appeared at the door, his expression urgent. Apollo's awake, he announced. Really awake. Dr. Hoffman says his vital signs are improving significantly. They rushed back to the ICU to find Apollo sitting up, still connected to monitors but visibly more alert. Emma sat cross-legged beside his enclosure, reading aloud from a picture book one of the nurses had found for her. Apollo's eyes were fixed on her, his ears perked forward attentively. Dr. Hoffman approached with an update. The new treatment protocol is working better than we anticipated. His kidney function is improving, and his cardiac rhythm has stabilized. If this continues, he allowed himself a cautious smile. Well, let's just say I'm significantly more optimistic than I was 6 hours ago. As the day progressed, news of Apollo's turnaround spread through the community with the same speed that had carried the initial alarm about the incident. The hospital reception area gradually filled with visitors, neighbors bringing cards for Apollo, Emma's classmates delivering handmade gifts, even the mayor stopping by with a photographer from the local paper. By late afternoon, James received a call that drew him away from the hospital temporarily. When he returned an hour later, he was accompanied by a television news crew. They heard about Apollo and want to do a feature story, he explained to Sarah. But more importantly, I brought something that might interest you. He handed Sarah a tablet computer. On the screen was a news article from 3 years earlier featuring a photograph of a German Shepherd that looked remarkably similar to Apollo. The headline read, "Military Working Dog Prevents School Tragedy." "This is Apollo's brother," Maximus, James explained. "He was successfully placed with a military K-9 unit after my brother acquired Apollo. 3 years ago, Maximus detected an intruder at an elementary school and subdued him before he could harm anyone. The man was found to be carrying weapons." The reporter, sensing a story even better than the one they'd come for, requested an interview with Sarah and James. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah agreed, recognizing the opportunity to not only celebrate Apollo but to help change public perception of dogs like him. "Apollo isn't just a pet," James explained to the cameras. "He comes from a lineage of working dogs bred specifically for their protective instincts and intelligence. What he did for Emma wasn't an accident or a fluke, it was exactly what he was born and trained to do." The reporter turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's been some controversy in your community about whether dogs like Apollo should be allowed in residential neighborhoods. What would you say to people who have concerns?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I would say that judgments based on breed or appearance miss the true measure of any animal or person for that matter. Apollo was judged by his size, his breed, his rescue status. But when it mattered most, he showed his true character through his actions." She glanced at Dr. Reynolds, who stood quietly at the back of the room. "Sometimes what looks like aggression is actually protection. Sometimes what we fear most is exactly what might save us." As the reporters packed up their equipment, Michael approached with his phone in hand, his expression a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. "You need to see this," he said, showing Sarah the screen. It displayed the online fundraiser Mrs. Peterson had started for Apollo's medical expenses. The total had surpassed $20,000, with donations continuing to pour in from across the country as Apollo's story spread through social media. More remarkable than the amount were the comments accompanying the donations. "Apollo is a hero. Thank you for protecting Emma. Get well soon, brave boy." And perhaps most significantly, from an anonymous donor who had contributed $5,000, "But for the dog who made me question everything I thought I knew about loyalty and protection. May you have a long life ahead." The courtroom stood silent as Judge Eleanor Harmon reviewed the documents before her. 2 weeks had passed since Apollo's miraculous recovery, and now the Mitchell family faced another critical moment, the custody hearing that would determine not only Apollo's fate but potentially Emma's as well. Michael had withdrawn his emergency custody petition after Apollo's heroism became clear, but the court still needed to rule on whether Apollo could legally remain in the household. Sarah sat at one table with her attorney, while the city's legal counsel occupied the other. Michael, in a move that still surprised Sarah, had chosen to sit behind her rather than with the opposition. Emma waited outside with Dr. Reynolds, shielded from the legal proceedings but ready to testify if needed. Apollo, still recovering but growing stronger each day, had been permitted to wait in an anteroom, an unprecedented allowance that spoke to the unusual nature of the case. Having reviewed all submitted evidence, Judge Harmon began, her voice measured and authoritative. "I am prepared to issue my ruling on the matter of the German Shepherd dog known as Apollo and his residency within Oak Ridge city limits." She adjusted her glasses, surveying the crowded courtroom. News of the hearing had attracted not only local residents but animal rights advocates from surrounding communities and even a documentary filmmaker. This court typically addresses matters of municipal code enforcement with straightforward application of local ordinances. However, the circumstances before us today are exceptional in several respects. The judge referenced the stack of documents. We have extensive evidence regarding Apollo's lineage, training history, and most significantly his actions on April 17, which unquestionably saved the life of minor child Emma Mitchell. Sarah held her breath as the judge continued. The city ordinance in question, Section 7.3 regarding dangerous animals, was established to protect citizens from potential harm. Yet in this case we have substantial testimony indicating that Apollo's presence actively increased safety rather than endangering it. Judge Harmon looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, this court recognizes the profound debt owed to your dog by this community. No municipal code should punish an animal for an act of protection that likely saved a child's life. A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom as Judge Harmon continued. Therefore, I rule that Apollo may remain in the Mitchell household without restriction or special permitting beyond standard animal licensing requirements. She paused, then added, furthermore, I am recommending that the City Council review and amend Section 7.3 to focus on documented dangerous behavior rather than breed-specific restrictions. Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as the judge concluded the formal proceedings. Outside, Emma waited anxiously with Dr. Reynolds clutching her now famous Apollo's friend pin. We won, sweetheart, Sarah announced, kneeling to embrace her daughter. Apollo can stay with us forever. Emma's face lit up with joy that quickly transformed to determination. Can we take him home now? He's been at the animal hospital for so long. Yes, Sarah confirmed. Dr. Patel says he's ready to come home today. The scene at the veterinary hospital resembled a homecoming parade more than a patient discharge. Staff lined the corridors to bid farewell to their famous patient. Apollo, though still moving carefully due to his healing wounds, walked proudly beside Emma, his posture alert and dignified despite his ordeal. Dr. Patel provided final care instructions and medications, adding, he's become something of a celebrity around here. Our waiting room has never been so full. Everyone wants to tell us about their own German shepherds now. The true surprise awaited them outside. What seemed like half the town had gathered in the hospital parking lot, forming an impromptu honor guard. Children held handmade signs reading, Welcome home Apollo and our hero dog. Mrs. Peterson, once Apollo's fiercest critic, stood at the front of the crowd, a basket of dog treats in her hands. We thought he deserved a proper welcome, she explained, seeming almost shy in the face of Sarah's emotional reaction. The neighborhood won't be the same without him patrolling it. The drive home became a slow procession as neighbors waved from their yards. Apollo sat regally in the back seat beside Emma, occasionally looking out the window with alert interest, as if assessing his territory after his absence. When they pulled into their driveway, Sarah was startled to see Michael's car already parked there, along with an unfamiliar truck bearing the logo of a professional fence company. Michael stood in the backyard directing workers who were reinforcing the fence around the property. He approached as Sarah and Emma helped Apollo from the car. I took the liberty, Michael explained, gesturing toward the work in progress. Thought we might want to make sure there are no more unwelcome visitors in the yard, snakes or otherwise. He knelt to greet Apollo, who recognized him immediately, tail wagging with genuine pleasure. Welcome home, big guy. The moment struck Sarah forcefully. Her ex-husband, who had once threatened to take Emma away because of Apollo, now ensuring the dog's territory was secure. Michael, I don't know what to say. He straightened, meeting her eyes with unexpected warmth. You don't need to say anything. Apollo protected our daughter when neither of us could be there. This is the least I can do. He hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about moving back to Oak Ridge. Found a teaching position at the community college that starts next semester. I'd be 15 minutes away instead of 3 hours. The implication hung in the air, not a reconciliation necessarily, but a rebuilt bridge that might allow them to be better co-parents, but to give Emma the stability of having both parents nearby. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak without betraying too much emotion. 6 months later, Oak Ridge celebrated the grand opening of the Apollo K-9 safety program at the community center. Sarah, now serving on the town council's public safety committee, cut the ribbon as Emma and Apollo stood beside her. The program, funded largely by donations that had continued to pour in after Apollo's story went national, would provide free safety training for dog owners and educational programs for children about responsible interaction with animals. Dr. Reynolds, who had become Apollo's regular veterinarian after Dr. Patel returned to her specialty practice, addressed the gathered crowd. "A year ago I stood before many of you advocating for restrictions that would have prevented dogs like Apollo from being part of our community. I was wrong." His voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "What I've learned, what Apollo has taught us all, is that safety doesn't come from fear and restriction. It comes from understanding proper training and recognizing the extraordinary bonds that can form between humans and animals." James Reeves, who had remained in Oak Ridge to help establish the program, introduced the first graduating class of the Apollo Therapy Dog Initiative 5 rescue dogs, concluding 2 German Shepherds, who had completed specialized training to work with children in local schools and hospitals. Apollo himself had found a new purpose beyond his family protection duties. Once fully recovered, he had begun visiting the children's ward at the regional hospital one day each week. His gentle demeanor with vulnerable patients earning him the nickname Dr. Apollo among the nursing staff. Emma accompanied him on these visits, proudly explaining to patients how Apollo had saved her life and showing them the techniques she had learned for safely interacting with dogs. The changes extended beyond Apollo and the Mitchell family. The town's animal shelter reported record adoption rates, with rescue dogs, particularly larger breeds, finding homes more easily than ever before. The revised city ordinance focusing on behavior rather than breed had become a model for neighboring communities. Michael, true to his word, had moved into a small house just 10 minutes from Sarah and Emma, creating a co-parenting arrangement that gave their daughter stability she had lacked since the divorce. On warm evenings, neighbors grew accustomed to the sight of Sarah, Emma, and Apollo walking together through the community park, occasionally joined by Michael or Dr. Reynolds. Apollo moved with the dignified bearing of one who had faced death and returned, his watchful gaze still alert for any threat to his family, but his demeanor confident and calm in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. One such evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Emma ran ahead with Apollo while Sarah and Michael followed at a more measured pace. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Michael asked, watching their daughter race across the grass, Apollo keeping perfect pace beside her. "If you hadn't adopted him, if he hadn't been there that day." Sarah shuddered slightly at the thought. "I try not to, but then I look at everything that's changed, not just for Emma but for the whole town. Or us." She glanced at her ex-husband, acknowledging the tentative friendship that had replaced their former bitterness. "Sometimes the best heroes come in unexpected packages," Michael observed as Apollo gently herded Emma away from a playground edge, his protective instincts forever vigilant. "And sometimes," Sarah added, watching the German Shepherd look back at them as if to ensure the entire family remained safely in his sight, "they're exactly who they were always meant to be." In the twilight of our lives, we come to understand that loyalty and protection often arrive in unexpected forms. Apollo's story reminds us that sometimes the things we fear most might be our greatest salvation. Like many of you, I've lived long enough to know that snap judgments, whether about people, animals, or situations, often lead us astray from profound truth. Just as Dr. Reynolds discovered after decades of misplaced fear, our preconceptions can blind us to the heroes walking beside us. How many guardians have we dismissed because they didn't match our expectations of what safety should look like? The deepest bonds in life, like the one between Emma and Apollo, transcend conventional understanding. They remind us that protection comes not from isolation or restriction but from connection and trust. As we navigate our senior years, perhaps Apollo's lesson matters most: second chances yield extraordinary returns. The dog scheduled for euthanasia became a community's hero. The broken family found new strength, the divided town united in purpose. May we all recognize the quiet guardians in our lives, and may we have the wisdom to welcome rather than fear them. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.